When people think of the Second World War, they often recall tanks, planes and front-line battles. But what often gets overlooked is the quiet struggle happening in the backyards and kitchens of ordinary families. In cities blacked out at night and villages stripped of resources, survival depended on more than courage. It demanded ingenuity. Fuel shortages, rationing and supply disruptions meant the average family could not rely on traditional stoves or heaters. So instead, they turned to what they had: scrap metal, broken tools, discarded drums and even parts of machines. From these scraps came stoves that not only cooked meals, but also kept families alive during winters that threatened to freeze homes from the inside out. These backyard creations were not luxuries, they were lifelines, hammered together under conditions where failure was simply not an option. Civilian families faced the same cold battles as soldiers. While soldiers dug trenches and improvised heaters at the front, civilians endured bombings, evacuations and crippling shortages. Coal and kerosene were rationed tightly across Europe and Asia. In Britain, fuel shortages meant many homes could not run their normal coal stoves for long. In the Soviet Union, families who had been displaced or whose homes were bombed often had to rebuild from the ground up, with no access to traditional supplies. The challenge was the same: how to generate enough heat for cooking and survival using only the scraps left behind by war. Families quickly learned that every piece of metal, no matter how bent or rusted, had potential. What had once been a bucket might now become the shell of a stove. A cracked oil drum could be cut down, refitted and turned into a heater. In those times, resourcefulness was worth more than money. Scrap metal became the backbone of improvised stoves. The most common backyard stoves of the Second World War were built from old barrels, tin cans and salvaged sheet metal. These materials were everywhere in wartime environments because industry was running at full capacity and waste piled up in unexpected forms. Families learned to cut small openings at the base for airflow, line the inside with bricks or clay for insulation, and fit makeshift chimneys to vent smoke safely. A simple 50-gallon drum could be transformed into a wood-burning stove by cutting a door at the front for fuel, adding a grate inside from repurposed wire mesh, and welding on a pipe for a chimney. Even those without welding skills managed with rivets, bolts or clay seals. These stoves burned wood, peat or even dried weeds, whatever could produce heat. The principle was not sophistication but practicality, taking what was at hand and reshaping it into something that sustained life. Backyard stoves reflected community as much as survival. In many neighbourhoods, these stoves were not built alone. Communities often came together to share skills and materials. One person might have a broken axle that could be shaped into a stove door, while another had the tools to cut metal cleanly. In Britain's bombed-out streets, neighbours pooled resources to build shared stoves in communal shelters. In rural Soviet villages, collective efforts turned abandoned machinery into heating units for entire families. These acts were as much about morale as survival. Sitting around the glow of a homemade stove gave families a sense of normalcy, a reminder that even amid chaos, warmth and food were still possible. For survivalists today, this speaks to the power of collective resourcefulness. Sometimes survival comes not from isolation, but from shared knowledge and effort. Wartime stoves taught lessons in fuel efficiency and conservation. Another remarkable aspect of these backyard stoves was how efficiently they used fuel. Because coal was scarce and wood supplies were limited, families learned to stretch every scrap of energy. Many stoves were designed to burn slowly, keeping embers alive for hours rather than producing large, wasteful flames. Clay liners inside stoves absorbed heat and radiated it long after the fire had died down. Some families even built double-chamber stoves, where gases from the first burn were fed into a second chamber to extract more energy before escaping. These methods were born out of necessity, but they remain valuable today. A modern survivalist with limited fuel can apply the same principles by insulating a fire pit with stone or clay, restricting airflow to create a slow burn, and capturing as much radiant heat as possible rather than letting it vanish up a chimney. These methods can still be applied in survival and homesteading. For anyone interested in self-reliance today, the wartime stove offers practical lessons. Start with a metal container such as a small barrel or even a large tin can. Cut a square opening near the base to feed fuel. Place a grate or flat stones above it to support cooking pots. If smoke is a concern, attach a metal pipe or dig a small trench leading outward to vent gases safely. Insulate the stove with soil or bricks to hold heat longer, to stretch fuel. Feed the fire with small sticks and twigs instead of large logs, keeping it smouldering instead of roaring. This is exactly what World War II families did, and it works just as effectively in a modern backyard, whether for off-grid cooking, emergency preparedness, or learning traditional skills. The knowledge is timeless because it solves a universal problem: how to survive when normal systems fail. Scrap metal stoves became symbols of endurance in wartime life. Looking back, these backyard stoves represent more than just practical solutions. They symbolize resilience. Every stove built from twisted scrap or discarded machinery was a statement of defiance against hardship. Families refused to freeze, refused to let shortages dictate whether they could feed themselves, and refused to surrender comfort entirely to the chaos of war. These stoves are not remembered as weapons of war, but in many ways they were just as important because they sustained the people behind the front lines. They remind us that survival is rarely about perfect conditions. It is about adaptability, grit, and the ability to see value where others see waste. The story of World War II backyard stoves is not only a historical account, but also a blueprint for resilience that still matters. For historians, it provides insight into how ordinary civilians endured conditions as brutal as any battlefield. For survivalists and homesteaders, it delivers practical techniques that can be replicated today. This is why these stories remain evergreen. They're not just about the past, they're about preparation for the future. If you value history that teaches survival and survival knowledge that draws strength from history, then subscribe to In the Beginning and share this video with others who seek the same. These lessons are too important to be forgotten, and together we keep them alive.